welcome back to yet another video. So glad to have you here. So this is going to be a video based a bit more on education, as sort of a follow-up to a video I did a few weeks back about what camera you should buy when you're first starting out as a photographer or videographer. And this video is going to be mainly about the 3 pillars of photography in shooting manual mode, and those are shutter speed, ISO, and aperture. I'm going to be going over like the basics of them, what is involved in them, how they work, and how to best use them to your advantage in photography. So this is going to be quite a long video because there's going to be a lot of information involved. So I'm going to put the time codes for each section in case there's a certain section you're looking for. You can just jump ahead to go look at whichever one you want. So without further ado, let's start with aperture. So aperture, f-stop or f-number, it's basically a hole within your camera's lens that lets a varied amount of light through. And this hole is created using various number of blades, also known as a diaphragm within the optics world. You'll commonly see aperture written as something called an f-number. So for example, f1.4, f2, f8, f16, f22, and so on and so forth. This f stands for focal length, with the substitute of focal length as a fraction. As you would expect, there are differences between taking a photo with a higher and a lower f-stop. The aperture size you use has a direct impact on the brightness of your photo. For example, an aperture of f1.4, for example, lets in a lot more light, whereas f22 lets a lot less light in, so it's a lot darker. Alongside the light levels of your photo being adjusted, f-stop also adjusts the depth of field of your photo, or in simple terms, how blurry the background and foreground of your photo are compared to your subject. For example, a lower f-stop, such as f1.4, the lowest this 85mm lens I'm using an example goes, the background is super blurry, and the little lights in the background become little orbs, called bokeh, or bokeh, or bokeh. I don't actually know, there's many ways that I've heard it said. But then if I switch the aperture to a higher f-stop, like f22, everything in the shot is in focus. But this means a lot less light is being allowed in, and I have to compensate for this using my ISO and shutter speed, which I'll talk about more later. Each lens you buy will have a set f-stop range. For example, the lens I'm shooting on at the moment is f2.8 to f22. There are also some telephoto lenses, particularly starter ones or kit lenses, which will have variable f-stops. And what this means is when you're zoomed out fully on this telephoto, the f-stop will be f3.5, for example, and then as you zoom in, it'll go to f5.6. But when you buy more expensive telephoto lenses, again like this 15 to 35, the f-stop will be f2.8 throughout. This is simply the fact of how much glass each lens has and all the components that are used to make them. They're quite expensive, so it's just a matter of cost to what you want, really. And that does it for aperture. Up next, we'll talk about ISO. So in very basic terms, ISO is essentially a camera setting that allows you to brighten or darken your photos. The setting allows for more flexibility, especially when shooting at night. Much like shooting film, the sensor, replace it with a roll of film. Each roll of film has its own ISO range, which allows for the brightness or the darkness of the photo to be adjusted via the film. Obviously, we have a lot more control with digital cameras these days with a simple switch, rather than having to change out the sensor itself. ISO values usually come as a number, ranging from 100 up to somewhere around 6400, maybe even higher depending on the camera you have. For example, some Sony cameras can go up to 25,000 ISO, which is mind-blowing. Saying all this, and as great as it sounds with the flexibility you get from ISO, there are some disadvantages. Here's an example of a photo taken with ISO 100. It is very clean, very sharp, no digital grain or distortion. But an example of a photo taken with ISO 6400, the image starts to have artifacts introduced as a form of digital grain. Generally speaking, you should try and keep your ISO as low as physically possible, because it means cleaner images. For example, in shooting, I tend to try and keep my ISO between 100 and about 600 to 800, depending on how dark it is. If it is a dark scene and you do need more light in your photo, first try adjusting your shutter speed and your aperture, or increase your external light, for example, like using a light box, which I've got next to me. Even when capturing photos with a high ISO, it's not the end of the world. For example, in Lightroom, there is noise reduction, which is probably one of the best that I've seen, and it has saved a lot of photos where I've accidentally shot in higher ISOs than I probably should have. So I think that does it for ISO, and up next, shutter speed. Now, last but not least, possibly my favorite way to capture creative images is using shutter speed. So shutter speed is responsible for 2 main things, and that is the level of brightness or light allowed into the sensor, and for capturing still motion or capturing motion. The shutter speed exists because of the camera shutter, which is essentially a curtain that goes in front of your sensor that opens up to allow light through for a varied amount of time. And once that shuts, that's your shutter speed. The shutter speed is essentially the length of time from close to open, back to close. The shutter speed is measured in time, from seconds for long exposures, all the way down to fractions of seconds for super fast shutters. Typically, most cameras allow for a 30-second long exposure as a set default, which you can adjust using a remote shutter for longer exposures, and typically they'll reach speeds of about 1/8000th of a second, I think most modern cameras do. Sometimes can be faster, sometimes can be slower. When you use a fast shutter speed, you typically have to balance it out with your aperture and your ISO, because the shutter is only allowing for a tiny amount of light through, and that means either increasing the aperture, ISO, or external light. But any subject that is moving within the frame of your photo with these higher shutter speeds, such as birds, cars, people running, they're going to be crisp and sharp because your shutter was capturing that instant moment. When using a slower shutter speed, the shutter is open for a really long time, allowing a ton of light through to your camera's sensor. This is perfect for night photography and still life at night. A little tip when using long shutter speeds is using a tripod, because there's only a small amount of time your hands can stay dead still for when shooting, and if you're shooting for a 15-second exposure, there's no way you're gonna be able to keep your hand dead still for that long. But these long exposures can be used to create amazing pieces of artwork, such as light trail photography or long exposures of cityscapes and water, and it is a great way to just get creative with the art of photography. So now you know the basics of the 3 pillars of photography. You can go out and experiment. You've got to experiment with using them together to work out how to get the best exposed photograph without noise, without any motion blur. You just have to practice. That is the best way to master them, is just to go out and spend hours and hours taking tons of rubbish photos, all overexposed, underexposed, just like I did when I started switching from the automatic shooting mode. It is terrifying, but it does help. The photos you are able to achieve when shooting in manual are going to be 1,000 times better than what you get in automatic. But that does it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. Leave a comment down below of what you struggled with most when it came to manual photography. I'd really love to know. As always, remember to like, subscribe. It really does help. We're trying to reach 100 subscribers by the end of 2022, and we're getting there slowly. So thank you for that. But anyway, I shall see you in the next video.